Hey guys, it's been a while. So we're back with a very long overdue episode of Meta Monday. So for those of you guys out of the loop, I took a little bit of a break. Of course, now I'm back to my daily live streams and YouTube videos. So let's go ahead and without further ado, get into the Meta Mondays. Now, we're going to talk about the balance patch notes because, of course, wait, look at this. There's going to be a balance patch tomorrow today, if you're watching this, actually. There was a balance patch today, actually, if you're watching this. Which means that there's stuff to evaluate in terms of how these new changes will affect the meta. So when Meta Mondays coincides with a balance patch, I like to do a somewhat preemptive approach to the idea of the new ladder, right? Normally, I leave these with a pretty big asterisk, like, oh, you know what? This is kind of predictive of what the meta will be. You know, this is a patch notes one. However, in this case, honestly, I don't even know if I have to do that because this patch actually won't change the competitive meta a ton. So before we get into anything at all, we need to actually just kind of briefly together go over the patch notes. Now, I already did a very long kind of analysis of like all the implications of these, you know, also on this channel that you can check out. But real quick, we're just going to go ahead and get into like the really fast nitty gritty. Okay, so Darius gets +1 health, probably won't 100% won't make a difference. Anivia gets -1 cost. I'm pretty skeptical. I don't think that'll make a difference. Braum gets +1 cost and +1 power and summons Mighty Pora for free the first time he survives damage. This is a pretty big deal. Getting a free 3/3 is really, really huge, and the 1 power will help him out in some other cases. This is a pretty big deal, especially considering Freljord is a pretty strong region right now, arguably the strongest, if not one of the strongest regions in the game. Super Mega Death Rocket gets reduced in cost by 1 mana. This is a fairly big deal, but I don't expect Jinx to be great in this meta right now. Genevieve and PNZ Aggro needs more tools. Genevieve Elmheart gets +1 power and +1 health, and this actually will see some attempts at being like swapped out for Cytheria in specifically like Misfortune Demacia decks. Overall, Cytheria is still going to be better in most decks. Unyielding Spirit gets set to fast and is therefore just a non-competitive card. Basilisk Rider gets +1 health, still bad. Captain Ferron gets 3 decimates instead of his old effect. This could actually be decent. This is a lot worse than it looks, but you could still run this in some kinds of like mid-range like tempo build water, sort of like the top end to kind of like a mid-range deck. In a certain meta, it could be runnable. Aurora Borealis is still bad, Pora Herder is still bad, She Who Wanders is still bad, They Who Endure is going to still be pretty good, +1 mana, so obviously you're still only going to run it in the same deck, and that deck didn't mind its mana that much, all things considered, so for the most part, this is going to be a nerf that you will feel, but it's not going to completely gut the card like most other cards would get gutted by this. I expect the They Who Endure deck to end up like high tier 2 or something like that. Ren Shadowblade gets reworked, but its new form is also completely useless. Jay Medarda goes down 2 cost for 2/2 in terms of stats and loses the elusive tag. So he's a 6/4/4 when I'm targeted and survive draw 1. This is actually fairly decent, but overall will almost certainly be just like a little bit too slow for how these games are going. Jay Medarda is something that a lot of people are very excited about, and I personally think that he has a hard time being competitive, but people will try to run him with like Draven Axes and like mid-range spell heavy decks, or like with some of like, you know, the Demacia package. Escape Abomination gets -1 health, which is a Cursed Keeper nerf. This is a fairly notable nerf, but not enough to make the Keeper combo bad per se. It is definitely something you will feel. Harrowing goes down 1 mana, so the biggest significance of this is now you can play it with Deny, which actually does matter if you're in like the Ionia Mirror. New Harrowing I don't expect to be great, but for the most part, people will try to run it with maybe like the old style Ash Harrowing finisher deck, or potentially like proper Ionia Hecarim with like Deathmark, Will of Ionia, and Deny style. Not all in ephemerals, you won't run like every ephemeral you can in that deck, but you will end up running Hecarim in the Harrowing. Dreg Judges gets -1 power, just as a bit of a nerf to deep. Mind Meld gets -1 cost, still non-competitive. And Petty Officer gets +1 health, which is actually a pretty big buff. Petty Officer is a really good card all of a sudden, because this card was already on the competitive level, and now it trades down to almost nothing. So that's a very brief rundown of just kind of like the patch notes. So now we're going to get into the actual tier list here for, you know, this kind of like patch notes. As you can see, I mean, based on, you know, kind of like how I've been feeling about it, for the most part, the patch isn't changing a lot on the competitive level. Most of the tweaks were either very minor or to cards that kind of like don't end up making a difference. I think Braum's buff will be pretty impactful, depending on kind of how the meta plays out. Although there might be enough aggro in the meta to keep Braum down, it's hard to say. But Braum's going to see a lot of experimentation in the first several days. And for the most part, the meta is not going to be too different. You know what? I forgot. Oh God, okay, there's one last change. This terrible sloppy. Okay, so Black Market Merchant loses 1 health. Not the biggest change ever. I don't think this will affect too much in terms of these decks' performance, like the Yoink deck or like his position in this deck. And lastly, Nab also draws from the bottom instead of the top, which is a buff to both Freljord and Bilgewater. Bilgewater actually didn't like drawing from the top, but Freljord liked it even less because drawing from the top gives your opponents boosted champ odds. So basically, that's it. Okay. Now back to this part like we're supposed to. Okay, great. Look at that. We're doing it. So what we have here is a meta that, you know, a couple of things are getting slightly nerfed. Mostly Tempo Endure, like I said. I expect this deck to kind of settle in tier 2. And we're going to enter a pretty aggro-driven meta. Elusive Burn, proper Burn, not like old Elusive OTK with Demacia, but proper Elusive Burn is going to be a very powerful deck, as well as even other forms of Burn or aggro, right? Potentially, as we might talk about later, some particularly spicy versions that you might be seeing on your screen right now. Okay, so that's kind of the one thing, you know, people are going to experiment with Braum, but it might be too aggressive of a meta that might keep him down. At the very least, we are probably going to see a lot of the healing cards right now, those being stuff like Withering Whale and Kindly Tavern Keeper should start emerging in the next several days. Okay, so as always, we're going to do a little bit of a statistical analysis on the tier 1 and tier 2 decks for this week. These are going to be decks that have, you know, above a 55% win rate or so, and what that's going to mean is that, you know, the tier 3 decks we're not going to be covering, but if you want to check them out, or if you want to check out any of the other decks, because maybe I'll have updated them, or maybe you want to import them for yourself, I'm going to put the link in the pinned comment like we always do, so you guys are going to be able to access all of this yourself. Okay, so starting off, we're going to be pretty simple and go with tier 1, starting with Elusive Burn. Elusive Burn is going to come out with an absolutely sickening 62% win rate. This is basically kind of like the new replacement to like the old PNZ Burn. We've got, you know, a lot of the Ionia elusive cards. They're going to be devaluing the blockers. And then, of course, you know, Burn and elusive kind of being the same general strategy. It's just don't let your opponent block you, force low interaction, and yeah, then win the game off of that. This is my current version of Elusive Burn. Here we're running a couple Elixirs of Wrath, just for a little bit of extra punch through. And yeah, I mean, honestly, there's not too much to say about this deck. It's going to be a super aggressive deck. You're just going to be blowing your opponent out super quickly. So if you want fast games and a fairly easy win rate, this is kind of like going to be the default deck for you. Now, I will say there's a fairly common misconception with aggro that it's completely brainless. You will actually have to think about a decent amount of things, right? Like this deck will take kind of anyone to like, you know, gold or plat, but after a certain point, you will actually have to like show a lot of like good decision-making skills to be able to get reliable wins with this deck. All right, next up, we've got Heimer Vi coming in at a 58% win rate. This is my current version here. These versions, I say, like, are my current versions. They're not too different. I think the most common versions of Elusive Burns are not running 2 Elixirs of Wrath, and the Heimer Vi is like, I'm running 1 clause. Some people run 2, some people run 3, some people run 0. It's just like minor ratioing, but this is kind of like where I'm currently at with Heimer Vi. I'm at 1 clause and 2 Static Shocks. It's the same Heimer Vi we know and love. Basically, pretty simple. You're just going to go ahead and play a fairly straightforward, like, sort of like mid-range strategy. Just try to like stop your opponent's game plan, plop Heimer out on turn 5 or 6 or 7, depending on kind of when you're able to protect him. And that's kind of the biggest important thing. The most important thing I see people misplay with this deck is like sometimes they'll play Heimer when they don't have the ability to protect him, which can be basically completely game losing depending on the matchup that you're in. So overall, this is kind of like one of the better decks right now. It's still pretty good. Nothing about this deck has really gotten nerfed from this patch, and some of the other tier 1 decks have gotten nerfed a little bit. So Heimer Vi is going to kind of retain its crown. I think I just tried to combine the words crown and throne in my mouth, and it just Whoops. Okay, next up we've got Burn Aggro. This is just like your classic Teemo slotted in Burn Aggro. Now, I will say, at this point in time, I think this is kind of like a slightly worse version of the Ionian one, but this one's actually not too far behind, coming in at a 59% win rate, just a couple percent lower. Ultimately, it's still a very solid deck. It's going to be a comfort choice for a lot of people. This is kind of like the current meta as it is now, so it's very possible the balance changes, even though they are fairly minor, could send the meta into less of an aggressive meta if there's enough reason to kind of like slow play. I don't know if there is going to be enough. To be perfectly honest with you guys, like, everyone's going to be experimenting with like Braum and Jay. Like, look, listen, I'm going to tell you this right now. Okay, everyone at the start is going to be experimenting with fun stuff. They're going to be experimenting with Braum, Captain Ferran, Jay Medarda, Harrowing, and maybe even like Mind Meld, right? People are going to try to have fun. Anivia. You know what all of these cards have in common? All of these decks have in common? They all can't beat this. Look at this deck in front of you. None of that can beat this, right? So if you just want to be a degenerate and just be, you know, just win games and just like be fully just no fun mode, play one of these two decks, Elusive Burn or Burn Aggro. These are very, very cheap decks. They're going to win you a lot of games. Your opponents are going to be trying to do all these fun strategies, trying to have a good time, trying to enjoy their video game, and you're just going to be here getting like free, easy wins super quickly and, you know, climbing the ladder system. Especially in the first couple of days when people are doing all of that stuff, these decks will be just absolutely demolishing, absolutely destroying in that window. But yeah, Burn Aggro, I mean, we're on Teemo ever since we lost the, Legion Rearguard got kind of like nerfed. In this version, we're currently on 2 Static Shocks. Some people like 1, some people, I tried 3 for a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of the only one who was liking 3. I know like Winding God and 209 also liked 3 for a while, but I'm back down to 2. 2 Static Shocks is kind of like my sweet spot here. Okay, next up, we have good old Kinko Elusive. Kinko Elusives comes in at a 57% win rate, and that is specifically for this version you're seeing right in front of you, which is my version of Kinko Elusives. I have very much liked this exact ratioing of stuff, 2 Twin, 1 Deny, 2 Fury, and 2 Zed in particular. A while ago when I was playing Kinko Elusives, I cut the 3rd Zed. This was, God, almost a month ago at this point, I guess. I took a break for a while. And it's proven to be very great. Like, double drawing Zed feels so bad with this deck because the second one turns into like the very useless Shadow Shift. And it actually has a notably higher win rate in the form that runs exactly like this. So I would highly recommend this version. It's gonna do very well. Again, this deck really hasn't seen too much change either. These are going to be kind of like just very elusive strategy. Your opponent's not going to be able to block. And it can actually do decently against some of those like elusive aggressive lists because we do have elusive blockers. And we even have Kinko Lifeblade to be able to heal. So it should do pretty well against something like Elusive Burn. Now, this is kind of like where the stats are saying tier 1 is, right? And again, this is not speculatory. This is based on, well, I mean, stats can lie to you sometimes. This is based off of the stats of the last like week or so. And ultimately, I don't see anything in the patch notes that would really be changing this. You know, like Tempo Endure gets knocked down a little bit. Perhaps something like Yoink Sejuani could get knocked down a little bit. People are going to experiment with new forms of a lot of different things. But ultimately, this is kind of where I see tier 1 for this upcoming meta. Ultimately, you'll notice a couple of things here. It's kind of toxic. Like, literally all 4 of these decks are basically winning via using either Elusive or Burn. Like, one of those 2 strategies, or both, in the case of Elusive Burn. So, yeah, this is definitely something that I'm not necessarily looking forward to, all things considered. When I was reading the patch notes, I was talking a little bit about how I was a little skeptical of the meta the patch notes might lead to, so hopefully it's not going to be this bad, but the stats are coming in with these 4 being kind of like the most dominant decks, and I don't really see this going away, especially with nothing really boosted in the form of, you know, protection or healing in any sort of significant way. So yeah, overall, I do expect a lot of these like very powerful, very aggressive decks to be forcing a decent amount of strategies down. However, if you want to be beating them, then you really want to be jamming some heals into your deck. Cards like Kindly Tavern Keeper, Withering Whale, etc. are going to do a pretty good job at that. And there's other like decent stabilization cards like PNZ Ionia can stabilize pretty well. All right, now let's go ahead and get into the tier 2 things now. Now tier 2 is currently on this sheet defined, wait, last updated June 11th. That is not right. Let's go ahead. Ooh, there we go. Tier 2 is currently defined at kind of like roughly 54 to 57% win rate, and that's where you're going to see these decks at. Now, Tempo Endure currently comes in at a 61% win rate. However, the reason I put it down here is because, of course, it's getting nerfed in 2 different ways. They Who Endure is going to 7 mana, and Cursed Keeper is going, well, the Escaped Abomination from Keeper is going to 3 health. And both of those are going to make a difference, right? At the end of the day, they might seem fairly minor. You might be like, well, on the average situation, the 1 mana for Endure doesn't matter, and there's plenty of situations where the 1 health on, like, the Escaped Abomination doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is literally just 2 or 3% win rate, and that stuff does add up. Like, little things like that are definitely going to be adding up, and this is a deck that could definitely maintain its tier 1 position, but I've at this current moment speculatively put this back into tier 2. This is kind of like an older version of my Tempo Endure deck. I've recently kind of like reverted back away from like the hapless aristocrat and gone back to like Bark Beast, Omen Hawk, and Fury of the North sort of like triangle, instead of going like full unit heavy with like Ancient Crocolith, and it's been doing better in this form as well. But it's a pretty straightforward deck. You're still going to try to kind of like shove your fist down your opponent's throat. You are going to be, you know, trying to slap your combos with like Cursed Keeper and Butcher, sometimes picking up like Bark Beast, Callista Haunted Relic triangles, and then finishing with like They Who Endure, Neverglade Collector Atrocity, these kinds of cards. For the most part, the deck has really not changed at all. Now, some people are going to experiment with some, you know, slot-ins. I actually expect a couple of people will try to revert back to old style like Control Endure with cards like Withering Whale, cutting out the Cursed Keeper package entirely. There's a couple of reasons for this, one of which is that, you know, going to 7 mana does kind of make more of a difference for this deck. Another of them being that the aggro meta right now will kind of incentivize like a healing heavy thing with cards like, you know, Withering Whale and stuff like that. So that kind of old school They Who Endure version could actually start replacing this one. Okay, next up we have Keg Control. Now, Keg Control is really quite interesting. So I based this off of the version by BBG. BBG made a version with, yeah, like Thresh and Gangplank. We've seen like these kinds of things in the past. The idea of, you know, having like these control elements, in this case like Dreadway, Bilgewater, Shadow Isles control. BBG's version here does something pretty unique. It cuts out some of like the Twisted Fate, which is something that almost all the other versions ran, and runs Gangplank and Thresh. Now, Thresh is going to be easy to level up because you're triggering a lot of deaths with your Kegs and with your Monkey Idol, and when Thresh levels up, it will pull out your Gangplank, pretty high value overall. You've got Dreadway as like a kind of like potential finisher here as well. So ultimately, it kind of all works together. Now, Petty Officer did just receive a pretty big buff. That +1 health matters quite a bit, and therefore it kind of fits this deck pretty decently. There's of course a lot of spells in this deck that are going to be able to capitalize off these free Kegs, you know, Make It Rain, Parlay, Withering Whale, Grasp. So we are going to have a pretty nice time jamming this deck. This should do fairly well against the like swath of aggression. Although if the aggression gets really bad, we might want to put like more Grasps and more Whales. Overall, this is actually going to be a pretty solid deck. This currently comes in on the stats at a 57% win rate. Really not bad, like kind of at the top of tier 2, although I will caution, it's a low sample size, so it's really hard to say. But in this patch, this concept gets better. I think that the healing cards like Grasp and Whale are going to get better, Petty Officer's getting buffed, and a couple of other things are getting worse, most notably They Who Endure. So, yeah, this could actually be a tier 1 deck. We could be, you know, obviously with some edits to suit the current meta, but we could be here next week on Meta Monday, on next Wednesday, and we could literally just be basically like, okay, wow, this is actually a tier 1 deck, guys. Jam it in. Okay, next up we've got Yoink Sejuani. Now, Yoink Sejuani is actually pretty interesting. This deck hasn't really undergone much changes. I actually ended up putting in one extra Petty Officer over a Navigator, because of course Petty Officer is just a little bit better now. It might not end up making a huge difference. I was running one before. This deck doesn't really use the kegs very much, but you still get decent value out of, like, you know, that flexibility in using a unit. Sometimes just like the keg with Make It Rain can force a reaction from the opponent that they really just don't want. So yeah, this is Yoink Sejuani. Black Market Merchant package is getting a bit nerfed, not too nerfed, right? Like 1 health on Black Market Merchant isn't going to change all too much. It's still going to be a fairly powerful combo. And I will say the big thing with this deck is it's actually kind of fallen off its win rate pretty big in the last like 3 or 4 weeks. This deck currently sits in the last week at a 55 to 56% win rate. Pretty average. I would consider 55 to be like an average win rate, I guess I would say. Obviously 50. So some smart ass might say, well, 50 is kind of like an average. And I mean, it depends on the sample you're averaging. But yeah, 55 in my opinion would be like an average win rate. And yeah, Yoink Sejuani is still able to hold a tier 2 position, but it's not as nuts as it was like in the early days of the old patch where it was actually kind of like running really rampant. The deck is basically very just like tempo driven. You just use a couple of the powerful Freljord cards and just try to like sort of rush the opponent down somewhat with the side plan of like Sejuani potentially flipping and, you know, giving you a more of a late game plan. All right, next up we have Prankster Burn. Now, I hear what you guys are saying. Hear me out on this one, okay? Prankster Burn. So this is my updated version of Prankster Burn. I will make some modifications to this. This isn't done yet, but Prankster Burn, yeah, oh shit. I should actually edit this because it's sort of disingenuous. Prankster Burn, you guys might remember as the deck that we got number 1 NA with, but number 1 NA shouldn't belong in the title as long as because it's a different version of the deck, really. So it's kind of like, it's sort of not really, it's not lying, but yeah, it's disingenuous to have it still say number 1 NA on the title. Okay, Prankster Burn. So this is kind of like the new Prankster Burn, right? And I think that this is a pretty good deck. Now, do I think this is a better form of Burn than some of the others? There's a lot of aggro decks vying for the top slot right now in a lot of different colors, right? Even like the Kill to Death, which we'll talk about in a minute, also using like Shadow Isles plus like proper Burn here, right? There's a lot going on. So can Prankster Burn survive in an environment like this? Well, it has a bit of a shot, a higher chance than it might seem. A really big deal right now is like, you know, having the Callista being able to potentially pull out like the used Cask Salesman is kind of insanely strong for this deck. But in addition to that, at this point in time, there's just kind of like a bit less reason to be in Freljord for the like Shadow Isles combo package, right? And that's a pretty big deal. Now, I will say, Prankster Burn, in this last week, I'm not the only one playing Prankster Burn. There are a couple of other people that have actually been kind of messing around with it, even as long ago as like 3 or 4 weeks ago. I've talked to some people that were like, yeah, I'm trying out Prankster Burn. I'm like, oh, cool. How's it going? And they're like, oh, pretty good. Social conversation sort of stuff. Anyway, Prankster Burn has come in this last week at a 57% win rate. Now, small sample size in this case. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Cursed Keeper is getting a bit nerfed, but this deck actually feels pretty solid, and it's got a shot, and there's a couple of ways you might build this for it to get even a little bit better. So this is a deck that I'm actually going to be experimenting with, and I feel like does have a chance to sort of resurge in a major way. Okay, next up we've got Killed to Death, which is the Shadow Isles Noxus kind of deck we made. It's just kind of like plugging in different pieces together, right? At this point, it's like, oh, the aggro from Shadow Isles with the aggro from Noxus, and then they go together. This comes in at a 55 to 56% win rate. So overall, yeah, pretty average, a little bit lower than the other forms of Shadow Isles aggro, even the Prankster Burn, although at a notably higher sample size, so could be more statistically significant. At the end of the day, it's a solid deck. Again, aggro is just so competitive. It's like elusive burn, burn aggro. Even like Kinko elusives, sort of slow plays, but fits most of the criteria of being an aggro deck. This one's debatable. But then there's like Prankster Burn, there's this deck Killed to Death. There's like 5 different ways of just kind of like combining the colors together to make your just like stick it in my style of aggro. So for the most part, I don't think these ones are going to be able to hold a candle to elusive burn. At the end of the day, elusive burn is just currently sort of reigning king. Now, if the meta shifts such that there will be a lot of elusive blockers in the meta, well, we might take a bit of a turn at that point. Suddenly, something like Prankster Burn could be on the up and up. We will see. Okay, Bannerman, kind of like vanilla as always. I've put 2 kindly tavern keepers in this. This might be a little preemptive, but I've basically felt that, you know, especially with kind of like the meta the way it is, even before this update, even just the last week of playing, there's so much aggro that I just kind of want to have a little bit of sort of like non-conditional healing. And kindly Tavern Keeper also just kind of works very well with the idea of a mid-range deck. Healing like Laurent Protege or Fiora, you know, mid-range mirrors, there's always kind of like a lot to be doing. So it usually feels fairly impactful. There are some other things that could be. Bannerman, as ever, hasn't really seen much changes, comes in at a 55% win rate. It's just good old Bannerman. There's like, you know, there's 3 things that just don't change in the world. There's death, taxes, and Bannerman. It's just like, it's just Bannerman, you know? It's the quintessential mid-range deck, very easy to play. You're just going to be challenging units and overpowering and finishing with Cytheria. In a deck like this, I don't think Genevieve has a chance of being proper. It really does have to be Cytheria in this sort of like mid-range style of deck. Whereas Genevieve worked in, well, actually, this deck. The next deck on our docket is MF Scouts. Also 55% win rate, and you'll notice this runs a lot of the same cards, but this is a more different deck than it seems like. I think that a lot of people will look at a lot of cards and be like, well, this is very similar. At the end of the day, though, a couple of cards can make a big difference, and the couple of cards we just had is enough to make the difference between a mid-range deck in the form of Bannerman or an aggro deck in the form of this Misfortune aggro. This is based off of the version by Nick Makes Plays, and in preparation for the Genevieve buff, I've replaced 2 Cytherias for 2 Genevieves, and we're going to play around with it and see how it works out. I've thought about Cytheria versus Genevieve a lot, and in a deck like this, God, they're really close. And that's crazy, by the way. That's crazy. Cytheria is an absolutely insane card, one of the best cards in the game. Ridiculous, this card. But Genevieve got a big buff, +1/+1, on a unit that has 2 valuable keywords. Like, those stats are going to scale more than they would on a regular unit. It's a ridiculous buff. Anything less, and I would have been like, well, no way, Cytheria for life. But man, could actually be hitting instead of Cytheria long term here. It's very, very possible. Okay, next up, we've got good old Deep. Deep comes in at a 55% win rate. Pretty par for the course. This is currently the kind of most stable version of Deep. Nothing too fancy here, just kind of like a lot of side tech cards. Deep does fairly well into a lot of the super burn strategies if it's teched for it. In this version, we've got 2 Grasps, 3 Whales, 3 Vile Feasts. So we're gonna do pretty decently against the very aggressive burn stuff, but at the same time, so much of this deck is tied up into this super late game that if you want to be countering burn or aggro with Shadow Isles, Deep's the worst way to do it. There's just anything else with Shadow Isles with Whale, Grasp, and Vile Feast is going to be better because it's going to come online a bit faster and just have less super slow kind of dud cards against the aggro matchup. And this is kind of the biggest problem with Sea Monsters Deep right now, is that it's kind of it's torn into an awkward place because the late game it has is a little bit committal to the point where it's really hard to put in enough early game to make the deck feel great at every point in time. So yeah, not much has changed here. It's Sea Monsters. I feel kind of I don't know, I said at the start of the video that yeah, this balance patch isn't changing a whole lot, and I mean, you'll see that in these decks. Like, at the end of the day, these decks aren't really changing a whole lot. Like, most of them aren't changing at all. Their cards aren't changed. Their tiers aren't changed. Deep is just, again, another example of that. Like, it's just kind of the same Deep deck, right? Now, here, however, is where things get a little bit interesting. Because I spent all day on stream today on twitch.tv/swimstream, where you can check me out for my daily streams and say hi to me in real time and have me flame the deck list that you tell me is good. Anyway, Tempo Brown. Okay, so Tempo Brown is an interesting concept that I was playing around with today. Now, of course, this is after the Brown buff, where Brown, again, it goes to 4 mana, but you get a free 3/3 Mighty Poro when it takes damage the first time, which is a pretty big deal. This is a bit of a weird deck. We were doing fairly well with it today. I have no idea how good this is going to be. It's very largely untested, but this is kind of where we can talk about Braum and different versions of potentially Braum being a good card. Now, Braum is a card that, again, you're going to have some problems against, like this aggro rush. That's going to be your biggest problem with Braum in this meta. But outside of aggro, Braum is kind of an insane card. And I will say, if Braum is kept down in this patch by aggro, if they nerf aggro, Braum could be dangerous, right? Like, this could be really, really nasty. Braum is a card that, at the end of the day, like, if you give him a permanent buff in the form of, like, Take Heart or, you know, Starlit Sea or, you know, Omen Hawk, just a decent amount of permanent buff, if the opponent doesn't have hard removal and they don't kill you in the next, like, turn, they basically can't win, right? Sort of similar to Heimerdinger in that regard. So this is one step in a series of concepts we played around with today, which is the idea of Starlit Seer Braum. So why Starlit Seer Braum? Well, it's not really just because, you know, Starlit Seer buffs Braum. That's a pretty small thing. At the end of it, it's just because in a Braum deck, you end up running a lot of spells. You're running Elixir of Iron, you're running Transfusion in this version, Culling Strike in this version, because it's Noxus. Depending on your second color with Braum, and we'll talk about different second colors, there's different spells you'll run. You're running Take Heart, you know, Braum's card is Take Heart, and Fury of the North. Like, you are going to run a lot of spells. Now, you don't need to build your deck to be all spells, but even so, Starlit Seer is still just a pretty good card, right? Like, even with a bit of spells. And the same tools that are keeping your Braum alive, like Elixir, Transfusion, are also threatening to keep your Starlit Seer alive. So it's kind of hard to pick this card off for value. Now, here's the trick with this deck. This deck basically runs a lot of high-value buff targets, right? So we're running Crimson Disciple, Ruthless Raider, Crimson Curator, Ember Maiden. We're running a couple Tavern Keepers just to try to survive aggro. But basically, you'll notice about all these cards is that they're pretty good buff targets, right? There's a lot of hands where, like, on turn 4, I'll just draw, like, a 5/3 Ruthless Raider. And that's crazy, right? On turn 4, you know, or turn 4 or 5, I might draw, like, you know, a 3/7 Braum. That's just crazy, right? That's really big. On turn, you know, 2 or 3, I could draw like a 3/4 Crimson Disciple. Basically, because everything in your deck is a very solid buff target, these random buffs work very well for your top decks, right? And this is the logic of, like, the very old school Kinko Elusives deck, like very early versions of Kinko Elusives that were using, like, basically they were abusing Omen Hawk. They were running, like, more widespread buff targets, trying to make sure everything in the deck was a good buff target for Omen Hawk. And they were running Braum for the same reason there, right? And this is kind of what I see in terms of Braum's potential right now. The idea of running just kind of like these heavy buff target decks, and it doesn't have to be a Noxus like this. You could run it with Heimerdinger. That's a concept that I was actually experimenting around with today, actually. Let me show you guys my client. I wasn't actually going to do this. These I didn't put on the tier list. These are completely experimental. I have no idea. So first of all, I didn't refine these at all. I just kind of like, they're just concept decks, right? But just take a peek at something like this. It's what you'd expect. It's just like Heimerdinger Braum. But a lot of the concepts fit together pretty nicely. You're going to be running a lot of spells because of both of them. You know, when Heimerdinger gets buffed a little bit, it's not bad. You obviously don't want Heimerdinger to be like a 7/10, but when it gets a couple of points, it's, you know, easier to survive. And Heimerdinger Freljord, especially if you have not played this game for a long time, you might be being like, Heimerdinger Freljord, that's crazy. Heimerdinger Freljord has been the way to play Heimerdinger in the past. It was a while ago. It was like the first or second meta, second or third meta of the game. But like the idea of stuff like Elixir of Iron being just absolutely insane ways of keeping a Heimerdinger alive are pretty powerful. So there is a lot to the idea of, yeah, something like Braumheimer maybe, right? Who knows? Now, Braum Ionia is definitely potential. Again, please don't look at this deck card for card. This is really unrefined. This one in particular, this one's terribly unrefined. But yeah, I mean, some kind of Ionia Braum deck that's not running Kinko elusives. We might be a little more aggressive with like Zed, or we might be, you know, a little bit more defensive. Who knows? But these are kind of the big directions I see with Braum. Running like a semi-spell heavy list. It doesn't have to be super spell heavy, doesn't have to be super all in. But it sort of paves the way for an archetype that we haven't really seen too much of before, which is the idea of the Freljord sort of like Freljord spell archetype, right? As it was before, it's like the spell decks are like, well, you know, you've got Heimer and PNZ, and stuff in Ionia, a lot of spell synergy there. You know, you've got even like Lux and Demacia. This is sort of like Freljord's Lux. And I'll point out like one last really big reason for this. This deck had a hard time existing, this kind of deck, this style of deck. Not necessarily the Noxus one, but again, the thesis of this deck is all of my units are going to be good buff targets, and I'm going to run a lot of random buffs in the form of Seer and Omenhawk. That's the thesis, okay? And this deck concept couldn't really make sense last update 24 hours ago. And the reason for that is just because Yoink decks were taken from the top. So if they just take your buffed card, you just lose. And suddenly, this kind of deck is looking pretty good. So I'm going to spend a lot of time messing around with this and seeing what kind of results I get, you know? So I've put it tenuously at the bottom of tier 2. I think this kind of concept is going to be solid, but we really have no idea, right? I don't think this is like really terrible or anything like that, but it's a solid concept. And this is kind of like the biggest exploration path of all the new changes. Is like the biggest one is just Braum is a solid card. There's many different ways to run him. And he even heralds in a effectively unseen archetype. Freljord spell synergy. Another one. Freljord Bilgewater like elusive deck with like Starlit Seer and Braum. That could work too. You know, you could run Braum and like Kinko. But it's just that style of deck is where he's going to shine the most. And that's it. That's, you know, that's all the tier 1 and tier 2 decks that we've got for the upcoming week. There's a couple of them that are going to be solid that we ended up trimming out. And yeah, I'm looking forward to... Yeah, looking forward to messing around with Braum. We're going to be looking forward to messing around with Braum and Prankster Burn. I think this deck could actually be pretty solid. So yeah, it's good to be back. Good to be back with our Meta Mondays. Man, this website's been actually like, it's been a little outdated. You might have seen when I had to refresh the webpage. Before I updated it just now, it was last updated on June 11th, which is literally a 2-week gap. And this is just because I took a break from everything. So the website was kind of like, normally I do like weekly updates, so it's like a fresh one every week, but it was a little outdated towards the end. Luckily the meta didn't change like a whole ton in those 2 weeks, but I feel a little bad. I'm normally better at keeping this at the very least weekly updated, even though I did take a break and I did kind of have to. But yeah, that's gonna be it for me. I hope you guys join me on stream today or tomorrow. Hit me up, just pop in. Come on over, twitch.tv/swimstream. We're going to be messing around with these decks and seeing if we can find improvements. And by the way, even though I was kind of dismissive of a lot of the buffs, when I went through the patch notes, stuff like Jay Medarda, stuff like Harrowing, I don't expect those to be good, but that doesn't mean I won't experiment with them. I'll still have fun messing around with different ways to make them good, even though I don't have enough confidence that they will be good to feel like I can recommend them here to you guys at this point in time on the tier list, right? That's all. Okay, but yeah, that's about all I got. See ya.